Chris and his friends came across a rather disturbing prophecy recently. They were out and about when they heard a man under a street lamp muttering something about the fog coming to cleanse the world. As they dug deeper, they found some strange stories about people who had similar experiences. All of these stories were linked to a date, July 17th. Well, that day has now arrived. The fog is here, getting closer with every second, and with it, something far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What will they find out as time runs out? Stay tuned. This is just the start of the nightmare.
As July 17th drew near, Chris and his friends grew more anxious by the day. They no longer treated this as a casual mystery or an internet hoax. The fog's arrival had started to feel inevitable, like the countdown to an apocalypse they couldn't avoid. Their conversations turned grim, and each meeting was tinged with nervous glances and tense whispers. The night before the dreaded date, they gathered one last time at Mia's house, each of them bringing supplies, flashlights, radios and face masks, unsure if those would even help. The atmosphere was heavy, the silence between them thicker than ever. They had done everything they could to prepare, but a lingering doubt hung over them. How do you prepare for something you can't truly understand? Mia's mother came in, asking if they were planning some kind of weird camping trip, given the supplies scattered around. They nervously laughed it off, saying it was just for a nighttime adventure. But the truth was, each of them planned to hunker down together that night, staying vigilant as midnight approached. They stayed up in Mia's living room, sitting in a circle with the lights off, the only illumination coming from a few flickering candles. No one was willing to admit it, but they were afraid of attracting attention, as if the fog could somehow sense light or sound. Chris sat at the edge of the group, staring at his phone, refreshing the subreddit obsessively, hoping for some last-minute insight or reassurance. Instead, all he saw were posts filled with panicked messages, last-minute sightings of strange people muttering "Nebula venitat purgandum mundum," and others desperately seeking guidance. At 11:50 p.m., 10 minutes to midnight, the group heard something from outside, an odd low hum that filled the air. They all froze, their eyes widening in fear. It wasn't a car, and it wasn't the sound of distant traffic. This was something else, something unnatural. "Do you hear that?" Sam whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. They nodded in silence, holding their breath as the sound grew louder, deeper, vibrating through the walls. The hum carried a strange weight, almost pressing against their eardrums. Mia's hand was shaking as she clutched her flashlight, her knuckles white as she tried to keep calm. Then, without warning, the lights flickered out, plunging the room into complete darkness. They heard Mia's mother shout from upstairs, followed by footsteps as she made her way down. "What's going on?" she yelled, her voice filled with confusion. But Chris quickly called out, trying to keep her from entering the living room. It's just a power outage," he stammered, not wanting to reveal the fear they all felt. "We'll be fine here." Mia's mother seemed unconvinced but didn't push further. She returned upstairs, and the group was left in near silence again, save for that haunting hum outside, which now seemed to be pulsing, growing in intensity. Suddenly, the air began to change. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying with it a distinct foul odor, a mix of wet soil, decaying leaves, and something else, something that smelled like rot. It was nauseating, the kind of scent that clawed its way into your nostrils and stayed there, lingering even as you tried to breathe through your mouth. They glanced at each other, horror dawning in their eyes. The fog was coming, and it wasn't just a harmless mist. It felt alive, malevolent, pressing against the walls as if testing the boundaries of the house. As the clock struck midnight, the fog rolled into the neighborhood. They couldn't see it directly from where they sat, but the air seemed heavier, denser. Chris grabbed a flashlight and slowly moved to the window, wiping away some of the condensation to peer outside. What he saw sent a jolt of terror through him. The fog wasn't just a light mist. This was a thick, dark, almost tangible mass that slithered through the streets like some otherworldly creature. It filled every crevice, hugging the ground as it crept closer to Mia's house. And within the fog, Chris could swear he saw shadows moving, humanoid shapes barely discernible, like something lurking just beneath the surface. "Guys, you need to see this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. One by one, they approached the window, each face going pale as they took in the scene. It was like something from a nightmare, a horror movie come to life. The fog was alive, pulsating as if breathing, and those shapes, those impossible shifting figures seemed to watch them, moving with purpose yet staying just out of focus. The fog pressed against the windows, blotting out any remaining light, enveloping the house in darkness. Then came the sound, the faint whispering voices, Latin phrases just like before, muttering in a continuous, endless chant. It was as if the fog itself was speaking, calling out, warning them, or maybe luring them. Mia let out a small whimper, gripping Chris's arm so tightly it hurt, but he didn't move. No one did. They were all rooted in place, paralyzed by fear. Then out of nowhere, they heard a loud crack, the sound of breaking glass. It came from the kitchen and everyone jumped, stifling screams. Eric grabbed the nearest object, a small kitchen knife they'd used earlier to cut snacks, holding it in front of him with a shaking hand. Is it inside?" Lara whispered, barely able to form the words. Chris, summoning every ounce of courage he had left, moved towards the kitchen, signaling for the others to stay put. He crept around the corner, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might give him away. The kitchen window was shattered, and a thick tendril of fog was snaking its way inside, curling along the floor, reaching out as if searching for something, or someone. Chris stumbled back, his foot hitting the edge of a chair, causing a loud thud that echoed through the silent room. And then, the fog seemed to react, shifting towards him, like a predator locking onto its prey. He scrambled back to the others, his face pale with terror. It's here," he gasped. "The fog, it's trying to get inside." They all huddled together, unsure of what to do. The fog was pressing against every window, every door, seeking entry, relentless in its pursuit. And as the Latin whispers grew louder, one thing became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't just fog. This was something far worse, something ancient and intelligent, something that had been waiting, watching, for this very moment. As they clung to each other, each of them silently wondered if they would make it through the night, or if the prophecy was about to come true, swallowing them all in its dark, suffocating embrace. The fog had forced Chris and his friends to barricade themselves inside Mia's house, blocking doors with whatever furniture they could find. Outside, the fog swirled with a strange, malevolent energy, pressing against the windows and doors, relentless in its pursuit. The whispers of Latin phrases grew louder, echoing throughout the house like a dark, ominous chant. The words were clearer now, as if calling to each of them personally. They huddled together in the living room, barely daring to breathe. Mia was shaking uncontrollably, clutching onto Chris's arm, her face pale with terror. Sam, usually the joker of the group, was now silent, his gaze fixated on the front door as if expecting something monstrous to burst through at any moment. "I don't think this is just fog," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. "It feels alive." Just as he said it, there was a loud thud against the door, making them all jump. Something, or someone, was outside. The knocking was rhythmic, almost deliberate like a heartbeat. Each knock resonated through the walls, intensifying the dread that clung to the air. "Maybe it's a person," Lara whispered, her voice filled with a glimmer of hope. "Maybe someone's out there trying to get in." "No," Eric muttered, his face tight with fear. No person would be out there. Not now. But despite the fear, Chris felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to move closer to the door. Against his better judgment, he approached it, peeking through the peephole. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. Standing just beyond the threshold was a figure shrouded in fog, its form almost indistinguishable from the mist itself. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness, and it seemed to radiate a malevolent intelligence. Chris stumbled back, his heart pounding. The figure wasn't just a passerby. It was waiting, watching, like a predator sizing up its prey. As he turned to warn the others, he heard the creature speak, its voice barely a whisper, yet filled with power.
Nebula venit epicantum, mundum.
It intoned, the Latin phrase rolling off its tongue with an unsettling familiarity. The words were the same as those spoken by the stranger under the street lamp weeks ago. But now, they carried a weight, a sense of finality, as if the fog was fulfilling a dark prophecy. Suddenly the creature raised a hand, pressing it against the door, and an icy chill spread through the wood, creeping into the house. Chris gasped as frost began forming on the door, inching toward them like the touch of death itself. The others looked on in horror, unable to move, trapped by fear. "We can't stay here," Sam muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "It's going to get in." "Where can we go?" Mia replied, her eyes wide with terror. "The fog is everywhere." The sound of breaking glass shattered their thoughts, and they spun around to see that one of the windows in the kitchen had cracked. The fog was pouring in through the opening, swirling and coiling like a snake, creeping along the floor toward them. They had no time left. Chris grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her toward the back door. "We have to get out of here, now!" They ran through the house, dodging the fog that seeped in through every crack and crevice, spilling into the hallways like a relentless flood. Eric grabbed a nearby chair, throwing it against a window in a desperate attempt to create an escape route. The glass shattered and he leapt through, beckoning for the others to follow. One by one, they crawled out of the house, landing on the cold, damp grass. But the fog was waiting for them outside, shifting and coiling, almost as if it was aware of their every move. The figures in the fog became clearer now, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, watching, calculating. They stumbled down the street, staying close together, hoping that if they kept moving, they might somehow escape. But the fog followed, lingering around them like a shadow, matching their every step. Then, just ahead, Chris spotted something, or rather, someone, standing in the middle of the street. It was another figure, cloaked in fog, its face obscured. But this figure seemed different, its stance less menacing, almost familiar. As they approached, Chris's heart stopped. It was the man from the street lamp, the one they had encountered weeks ago. The man raised his hand, and the fog around him parted slightly as if he controlled it. His face was hollow, eyes sunken, but there was a glint of something. Recognition, understanding. He looked directly at Chris and spoke in a voice that was both weary and resolute. "You should not be here," he said softly, his voice carrying over the fog. "This is not your fate." "What? What does that mean?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. The man didn't answer. Instead, he lifted his hands, and the fog around them thickened, obscuring everything. It was as if the man had become one with the fog, his body dissolving into the mist. But his eyes remained, piercing through the darkness, locked on Chris. Leave, he said one last time, his voice echoing through the fog. "While you still can." With that, the fog surged forward, enveloping the street, swallowing the man and obscuring everything. Chris and his friends stumbled backward, terror overwhelming them. They turned and ran, their footsteps pounding against the pavement, desperate to escape the clutches of the fog. As they reached the edge of town, the fog seemed to retreat slightly, its grip loosening. They could still hear the whispers, the echoes of Latin phrases carried by the wind. But the fog didn't follow them beyond the boundary, as if bound by some invisible force. They collapsed on the grass, gasping for breath, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. They were alive, but they knew that the fog wasn't done. It lingered on the edges of town, watching, waiting, a constant reminder of the darkness that had come to cleanse the world. And as they sat there, catching their breath, they each silently wondered, how much time did they really have? As dawn began to break over the horizon, Chris and his friends lay sprawled on the damp grass at the edge of town, staring up at the sky. The fog had finally receded, curling away from the town as if retreating back to wherever it had come from, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. But there was no relief in their hearts, only a profound sense of dread that seemed to linger like the mist itself. The group sat there in silence, each one lost in their thoughts, trying to comprehend the nightmare they had just survived. Chris's mind raced through everything they had seen and heard, the cryptic Latin warnings, the figures in the fog, and, most chilling of all, the strange man who seemed to control the mist and who had told them to leave. What was that? Sam finally whispered, breaking the silence. His voice was barely a croak, and his hands shook as he hugged his knees. That wasn't just fog. It felt alive. Chris nodded, but he had no answers. The fog had been more than just a natural phenomenon. It had a purpose, a consciousness, something beyond human understanding. The man's words echoed in his mind. This is not your fate. What had he meant by that? Was it a warning? A promise? They stood up, shaking and exhausted, and started walking back into town. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound in a place that should have been bustling with morning life. As they passed homes and shops, they noticed the devastation left by the fog, broken windows, overturned cars, and eerie scorch marks along the buildings, as if the fog had burned whatever it touched. But the strangest part was the absence of people. They called out, but no one responded. Every street was empty, every door left ajar, like the entire town had vanished into thin air. It was as if they were the last people left in the world. The realization settled over them like a heavy shroud, filling them with a new wave of fear. What happened to everyone? Mia whispered, clutching Chris's arm. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of life, but there was none. Maybe they didn't survive, Lara said, her voice barely audible. The thought was terrifying. Had the fog consumed everyone in town, leaving them as the sole survivors? The thought chilled Chris to the core. As they continued walking, they noticed strange markings on the ground, symbols etched into the dirt where the fog had lingered the longest. The symbols looked ancient, almost ritualistic, like something out of an occult book. Chris crouched down to get a better look, his mind racing with questions. The markings were indecipherable, yet familiar, almost as if they'd seen them before on that subreddit. The strange symbols people had posted, warnings of the fog, prophecies of the doom that awaited them all. The markings made him realize something even more horrifying. The fog's arrival hadn't been random. It had been planned, almost summoned, like a curse unleashed upon the town. The conspiracy theory had been real all along. The fog was part of a dark ritual, a cleansing just as the man had said. The fog comes to cleanse the world. They moved on, their hearts heavy with fear and confusion, until they reached the town square. And there, in the center of the square, they saw him, the man from the fog. He stood alone, his figure cloaked in darkness, his face partially obscured by shadows. But his eyes gleamed with a knowing look, almost as if he'd been waiting for them. Chris's blood ran cold. How could he be here? They'd seen him disappear into the mist. It was impossible. Yet there he stood, as real as any of them, watching them with a chilling intensity. "Why are you here?" Chris demanded, his voice shaking. "What did you do to everyone?" The man tilted his head, a faint, almost pitying smile playing on his lips. "They were chosen," he replied, his voice carrying an unsettling calmness. "They embraced the fog. They found peace in its cleansing." "Cleansing?" Mia cried, her voice breaking. "You killed them!" The man shook his head slowly. "No, child. I did not kill them. They became part of something greater. They transcended. Chris felt a surge of anger and fear mingling within him. Why did you let us go then? Why tell us to leave? The man's gaze shifted to Chris, his eyes piercing, almost sad. Because your time has not yet come, he replied. But one day it will. The fog will return, and you will have to decide, embrace it or resist. A chill ran down Chris's spine. The man was telling them that this was just the beginning, that they would face the fog again someday. He wanted to run, to scream, to demand answers, but his body felt frozen, trapped under the weight of the man's gaze. The man took a step back, raising his hand in a strange gesture, almost a farewell. Remember, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. The fog is always watching, waiting. And when it returns, it will be your choice, to cleanse or to suffer. With that, the man faded into the morning light, his figure dissolving like smoke, until he was gone, leaving only silence in his wake. The friends stood there, rooted to the spot, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Finally, Sam broke the silence. What? What do we do now? Chris looked around at his friends, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to say, what to think. All he knew was that they were no longer safe, that the fog had marked them, and that one day it would return for them. Let's get out of here, he muttered, his voice barely audible. As far away as we can. They walked out of the town together, leaving behind the remnants of their lives, their past, and the dark memory of the fog that had nearly consumed them all. But as they left, each of them carried the same haunting thought, echoing in their minds like a curse. The fog was waiting, and it would come back.
The mystery of the fog is finally unveiled, but questions remain. What would you have done? Would you have continued to search for answers or accepted the impending fate? Let us know in the comments what you think, and if this story has unsettled and intrigued you, share the video, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. Help us bring more spine-chilling stories to light. And remember, the abyss is waiting for you.